Today we're talking about the last sheriff in the book of Judges, Samson. Samson is perhaps the most infamous of all the judges. Most people know him for his strength, which was found in his hair, and for his weakness, which was found in his woman. But behind the brute strength and the babes of this story is what I believe to be a commentary instructing us in what it means to strive to do extraordinary things for God. Underneath the rough exterior of Samson's life is a beautiful lesson about what happens when you try to do something great for God. And also what happens when you consistently neglect to honor your consecration and your vows before God. Today, we are talking about consecrated crowns. Here we go. Okay, so I'd like to start off our time today by doing a little bit of recap. We ended with our last judge, Yiftach. Yiftach was my favorite judge. He was also the 8th of 12 judges. So we skipped over a few to get here. I think those guys we skipped over are worth mentioning because they provide a bit of context both for Yift's story and also for Samson's story. So after Yiftach, there are 3 more judges. There's a guy named Ibzan from the town of Bethlehem, Elon from the tribe of Zebulun, and a guy named Abdon, the son of Hillel. There's not much information that we are given about these guys, but the little bit of info that we are given about them, I think, is significant. So let's start with Ibzan. This guy, unlike Yif, had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and he is able to give all of his sons a wife in marriage and all of his daughters a husband. Now, I find that a bit interesting because if you look back at the judge who came before Yif, that would be judge number 7. That judge also had a lot of kids. Yair, the Gileadite, is the judge before Yif. He is also said to have 30 sons. Those 30 sons had 30 donkeys, and each son had their own little town or hamlet, which amounted to 30 towns. So he had 30 sons, 30 donkeys, 30 towns. It's a bit strange in my opinion because Yair is first mentioned in the Torah. I mentioned this in our first episode. Yair is mentioned during the years of the wilderness wanderings, way before this. So it seems like the authors of the Judges have stuck him besides Yif's story here in the mentioning of, and this mentioning of Yair, the emphasis is more on Yair's children than his towns. So here in Judges, they have emphasized Yair's 30 children and those 30 towns. Additionally, there are 3 sets of 30 that are highlighted in Yair's life, right? So 3 is also important. 30 sons, 30 donkeys, 30 cities. This maps well onto the judge right after Yif, who also has 3 sets of 30. 30 sons and 30 daughters, and 30 wives that he arranges for those sons, and 30 husbands he arranges for those 30 daughters. So actually 4 sets of 30. What's going on here? Clearly the authors are not going in a chronological order with these stories and these judges. It seems like they are trying to emphasize or say something about the number 30 and about children as well. But so what are they trying to tell us? Well, let's remember that the number 3 in the Bible can usually denote both a test and also salvation. That begs the question, what was the big test which Yiftach failed? Well, if you remember, that was the test, that was the oath that he made with God, the words which he uttered and could not take back. He failed the test of his words. As a result of this hasty oath, Yif lost his only daughter and his whole family lineage. So it seems to me that these judges, Yair and Ibzan, are sandwiching Yiftach with children, right? And they're 3 sets of 30, or 3 sets of 30 for Yair and 4 sets of 30 for Ibzan. They're cluing us, the reader, into what the main takeaway of Yif's story should be. That is the passing of the test in order to save and preserve one's family line. Yif, even though he saves Israel, cannot save his own family. He is surrounded by 2 men that, while they do not have any great exploits that are recorded, they are said to have very fruitful and prosperous families. Then there's a judge who comes right before Samson, Abdon, the son of Hillel. This guy is said to have 40 sons and 30 grandsons. They all ride on a donkey each, so a total of 70 donkeys. This is highlighting the theme of children again. But this time, he has almost a whole nation of children and a whole nation of royal steeds. I say that because, as we've talked about before, 70 is a number which usually represents nations in the Bible. This is also very fitting because Samson's story will begin with a barren woman who cannot conceive. This woman will then be visited by an angel and told that her son will begin to save Israel. So it seems to me that there is a little recurring pattern here in these last couple of judges. That pattern is fertility and barrenness, of failing tests and being saved by God. Okay, so with that being said, let's jump into Samson's story, his origin story, starting in Judges 13, verse 1. Then the sons of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh, so that Yahweh gave them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. There's a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had borne no children. Then the angel of Yahweh appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and give birth to a son. So now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, nor eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Then the woman came and told her husband, saying, A man of God came to me, and his appearance was like the appearance of an angel, very awesome. I did not ask him where he came from, nor did he tell me his name. And he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and give birth to a son. So now you shall not drink wine or strong drink. You shall not eat anything unclean, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Okay, there's a few things to note here. First, I find it really interesting that we're given the husband's name, Manoah, which we'll talk about more soon, but not the wife's name. The husband's name, Manoah, means resting place, and if you couldn't tell, it comes from the word Noah, from Noah's name. It's Manoah. Noah's name means rest. Tuck this away because Manoah's name will be important toward the end of this story. And it's actually going to be important like 2 podcasts from now. That's how long Samson's story is going to take. So Manoah's wife is called literally an Isha, or a woman in Hebrew. This sounds like we could be entering into that theme of the seed of the woman and the seed of the snake here again. Because this woman is barren, is told that she will give birth to a son who will save Israel. So her son is said to bring salvation, and she is also simply called a woman. Okay, something to note. That's great and all, but there's also these really weird instructions the angel gives this woman. He tells her not to drink any wine or alcohol and not to eat anything that is ritually unclean. But then he tells her that her son will be a Nazarite to God, even from the womb, and that she can never cut his hair for essentially like his whole life. So I understand the telling her not to drink wine because pregnant women shouldn't drink alcohol, or so I've heard. But why the odd detail about not cutting his hair? And also, what's a Nazarite? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take some time to dive into those questions, because I think that at the heart of Samson's story is this special and somewhat strange Nazarite vow. I actually believe that Samson's story is a commentary on the Nazarite vow, because not only is Samson's story ripe with allusions to the Nazarite vow, but Samson is essentially the only person in the whole Hebrew Bible who is expressly commanded and said to be a Nazarite. So the stipulations for the Nazarite vow are really only mentioned once in the Bible, in Numbers chapter 6. In this chapter, Yahweh tells Moses that whenever a man or woman makes a wonderful vow, the vow of a Nazarite to dedicate himself as a Nazarite to Yahweh, this person shall abstain from 3 things. So first, they cannot drink any wine or alcohol. They cannot even drink any grape juice. No Welch's. They can't eat anything that comes from the grapevine. No grape skins. Not even grape seeds. I assume this also means no grapeseed oil. That's the first stipulation. Next, the person taking on this vow is not allowed to cut the hair on their head for the whole length of the vow, right? So they're not allowed to cut the hair on their head for the entirety of this vow. And third, they cannot go near a dead person. Even if their family member dies, they can't go and bury the body. Those are the 3 stipulations. No wine, no grapes or alcohol, no dead people or funerals, and you can't cut your hair. Why these 3 stipulations? And why can't you cut your hair? Well, here is where it is really helpful to understand what a Nazirite is and what the word means. A Nazirite comes from the Hebrew word Nazir. This word Nazir can have 2 meanings. It can mean consecrated, but it can also mean crown. So a Nazirite vow is literally a vow of consecration. It is a vow which you consecrate and set yourself aside to be totally devoted to Yahweh. This is symbolized by your hair, which becomes a crown in itself that grows on your head during your period of consecration. When the period of consecration is over, the man or woman is supposed to bring 7 different offerings to the temple. All right, that's a lot of offerings. They're supposed to bring a burnt offering, a sin offering, a peace offering, a grain offering, some wafers, and a drink offering, right? While the peace offering is being burnt up, the Nazirite is supposed to cut off their hair. So this hair was their symbolic crown of consecration that grew during their vow, right? Then, after they cut off their hair while the peace offering is being burnt, they have to throw it into the fire that they throw their hair into the fire of the peace offering while the peace offering is being cooked. This is important because it's like the person is seasoning this peace offering with their hair. Probably wouldn't smell very good or taste very good. But again, this symbolizes both the time that they were devoted to God and also their royal crown of consecration. I should note here that the priests, specifically the high priest, would wear a crown on their head that said, Kadosh LaYahweh, or devoted to Yahweh. So this crown, this vow of consecration was kind of like a way for really any Israelite to set aside a period of time and become like their own mini high priest. Kind of cool, right? They're wearing a crown of consecration via their hair. The high priest wore a crown that said devoted to Yahweh. I should also note here that in this story, Samson is called to be a Nazirite for his whole life. So his whole life is set aside as this priestly consecrated vow to Yahweh. And I believe his hair is supposed to symbolize this giant crown of consecration. Now, before we go back to the Samson story, there's one more thing that's really important that I would like to point out about this Nazirite vow that I need to mention, and that is the introduction to the vow. In number 6, when Yahweh speaks to Moses and says, when a man or woman makes a wonderful vow, the vow of a Nazirite, that word wonderful sounds like a strange way of describing this vow, and understanding the word wonderful in this description in number 6 is really important to understanding Samson's story, because it describes the kind of vow a Nazirite takes on. This word wonderful, and it's translated as wonderful in most Bibles, is the Hebrew word palah. Palah means marvelous, extraordinary, or distinguished. It describes a really difficult, noble, or even improbable feat or accomplishment. It can also describe the people who do those tasks. So a good example of this word, palah, is actually in the first time that this word is used in the Bible. So palah is first used in Genesis 18, when Sarah hears God telling Abraham that they are going to have a child in their old age. God overhears Sarah laughing and says, is it anything too palah for Yahweh? And then God goes on to say that by that time next year, Sarah will have a son in her old age. Excuse me. So this vow for people who want to do extraordinary, improbable, and maybe even miraculous feats for Yahweh is a Nazirite vow. If you're wondering what in the world that kind of vow would look like, well, remember, Samson's story is a commentary on what a palah, or a wonderful vow of devotion of a Nazirite will look like. Okay, Hope that made sense. Let's keep going in the story. Judges 13, starting in verse 8. Then Manoah entreated Yahweh and said, O Lord, please let the man of God whom you have sent come to us again, that he may instruct us to do what to do for the boy who is to be born. And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came again, and the woman came again to the woman as she was sitting in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. So the woman ran quickly and told her husband, and she said to him, Behold, the man who came the other day to me has appeared to me. Then Manoah arose and followed his wife, and when he came to the man, he said to him, Are you the man who spoke to the woman? And he said, I am. So Manoah said, Now your words will come to pass. What shall be the judgment governing the boy and his work? So the angel of Yahweh said to Manoah, Let the woman be careful in all that I said. She should not eat anything that comes from the vine, or drink any wine or strong drink, nor eat anything unclean. Let her keep all that I commanded. Then Manoah said to the angel of Yahweh, Please let us delay you so that we may prepare a young goat for you. And the angel of Yahweh said to Manoah, Though you delay me, I will eat your bread. I will not eat your bread. But if you prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to Yahweh. For Manoah did not know that he was an angel of Yahweh. Then Manoah said to the angel of Yahweh, What is your name, so that when your words come to pass, we may honor you? But the angel of Yahweh said to him, Why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful? So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to Yahweh. And he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. Indeed, it happened when the flame went up from the altar toward the heavens, that the angel of Yahweh went up in the flame of the altar. And Manoah and his wife saw, so they fell on their faces to the ground. Now the angel of Yahweh did not appear to Manoah or his wife again. Then Manoah knew that he was an angel of Yahweh. So Manoah said to his wife, We will surely die, for we have seen God. But his wife said to him, If Yahweh had desired to put us to death, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have let us hear these things like this at this time. Then the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. And the child grew up, and Yahweh blessed him, and the spirit of Yahweh began to beat in him in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Probably saying that wrong. Okay, so there's a few things that should stick out here. First of all, doesn't it seem weird that the angel will only appear to the woman? It's like Manoah's wife, the woman in the story, is the only one getting the commands from God. And Manoah, every time he asks for more answers, curiously is left out of the loop on how you're supposed to raise Samson. He's curiously not given knowledge in this story, but the woman is. I should also mention that the woman only tells Manoah that she is to abstain from wine and unclean food, and that Samson is to be a Nazirite. So she tells him, hey, I can't, this is what the angel told me, I can't drink wine or eat unclean food, and Samson's supposed to be a Nazirite. However, neither she nor the angel will expressly tell Manoah that the boy is never to cut his hair. The woman will tell Manoah that their child is to be a Nazirite, but she doesn't include the instructions about not cutting his hair. And then the angel completely leaves out the detail about the child being a Nazirite. In fact, the angel only repeats what the woman told him to do. This leads me to my next point, which is that this woman is told to keep part of the stipulations for the Nazirite while she is pregnant with Samson. It is almost like she is keeping the vow partially with Samson. It is also like this woman and the angel have a little secret that they are keeping and that they are preventing Manoah from knowing. That secret curiously, is the detail about Samson never cutting his hair. And a little bit of a spoiler in the story, Samson's hair is the key to his power. This is important for two reasons. For the rest of Samson's story, he will struggle with giving away important secrets to other women. Those secrets will hurt him and those around him. Every single woman in Samson's life from this point onward will give away secrets to other men who will in turn hurt him. Every woman except his mother, that is. Samson's undoing in life will be giving away secrets to the woman whom he is supposed to be able to trust. The other reason why his secret is really important is because it seems to be an inversion of the Garden of Eden story. In that story, the husband, Adam, is named, but the wife is simply called a woman. Eve is not named until after they leave the garden. And while they are in the garden, Adam is the one given the divine commandment directly by God to not eat from the tree of knowing good and evil. We see in that story that Eve is incorrectly relayed that the command to not eat from the tree of knowing good and evil when the snake tempts her to eat from that tree. She tells the snake that God told them to not even touch the tree. So God tells Adam not to eat from that tree. Eve seems to indicate in the Garden of Eden narrative that Adam told her, don't even touch the tree. And that is their downfall. The secret command, which was incorrectly relayed, when Adam has a chance to correct Eve, because he's actually right there with her when she eats from the tree, he just goes along for the ride. So that was the Adam and Eve story, right? Here, the husband Manoah is named, and his wife is simply called a woman, just like in the Eden narrative. But instead of the named husband receiving the divine commandment, from God, the unnamed woman receives the divine commandment. So there's an inversion. Instead of the man receiving instructions from God, now it's the woman. And instead of the woman being left out of the loop or given kind of bad instructions, like a game of telephone, now it's the man who's given incomplete instructions. Even when the husband meets an angel of Yahweh, this angel leaves out the most important bit about Samson's hair. So I find all of that really interesting, and all of this seems to be an inversion of the Eden narrative. What's more, it feels like the husband throughout this whole story is always devoid of knowledge and information, something that the tree of knowledge of good and evil clearly offered. The husband hears about this encounter his wife had with a man of God. Then he prays to God for more instruction on what to do with this really special child that he's going to have. Kind of maybe a good thing to do. But then when the angel comes, he's given no information. When the angel leaves, Manoah realizes that it was an angel and he thinks they're going to die. But very fittingly, his wife tells him they won't die. So Manoah is always out of the loop. His wife's having him to tell him what to do this whole time. To me, it feels like this part of the story is a reversal to the Eden narrative in a lot of ways. But it also feels like Samson's mother is somewhat protecting him. By keeping this knowledge a secret, it seems like Samson's mother is keeping as few people from knowing where his true power lies. This theme of Samson's secrets will develop with each passing woman in his life. Okay, before we move on, I have to talk about the angel's name. Manoah asks the angel what his name is, and the angel says, "Why do you ask my name when it is wonderful?" You may have guessed, the word translated as wonderful is indeed that Hebrew word palah. Then in the very next verse, when the angel burns up their offering in the pillar of fire, we are told that the angel did a palah, or wondrous thing, in front of them. So this angel that says that his name is palah, that is too wonderful, and then he does a palah, or a wonderful, extraordinary thing, by performing a miracle in front of Manoah and his wife. That's really cool, but what does it mean? I think that this angel, whom you could call the extraordinary angel, is a messenger telling this husband and his wife that their son is going to be an extraordinary Nazirite, someone who is devoted and set apart to do extraordinary things for God. He is an extraordinary messenger to tell them about their extraordinary son. We should also remember that Samson's story is a commentary on the Nazarite vow. We're seeing right here what it looks like to be consecrated to do extraordinary things for God. It looks like the miraculous birth and life of Samson. In other words, it seems like this angel's name is another clue to you, the reader, to go back to where that word Palah is used in number 6 with the Nazarite vow, and for you to make this connection to see, okay, this story is a message of sorts as to what it looks like to be a Nazarite, to do something extraordinary and to take an extraordinary vow for God. Okay, so let's keep going on in the story. Judges 14 in verse 1, now we're getting into Samson's actual life. Then Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he came back and told his father and mother, I saw a woman in Timnah of the Philistines. So now take her for me as a wife. But his father and his mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you go take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Take her for me, for she is right in my eyes. However, his father and mother did not know that it was of Yahweh, for he was seeking an occasion against the Philistines. Now at that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. Then Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and they came as far as the vineyard of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. And the Spirit of Yahweh rushed mightily upon him, so that he tore it as one tears a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. So he went down and spoke to the woman, and she was right in his eyes. Then he returned to take her, and turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the body of the lion. So he scraped the honey into his palm, and went on eating as he went. Then he went to his father and mother, and gave them, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey out of the body of the lion. Okay, this whole section is one big allusion, yet again, to, you guessed it, the Eden narrative. In the Garden of Eden, when Eve is tempted by the serpent, we are told that she saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable for making one wise. So she took from its fruit and ate, and she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Throughout most of the Bible, whenever something is good in someone's eyes, it is usually alluding to Eve, and placing that character proverbially in front of the tree of knowing good and evil. Whatever thing which they say is good or right in their own eyes is almost always their own forbidden fruit. So anytime you see the word, like this phrase, something was good in someone's eyes, it's like they're getting transported to the tree of knowing good and evil, and that thing, whatever, or that person, whatever it is their own forbidden fruit. Additionally, he is said to, Samson is said to tell his father to take this woman for him as a wife twice. Then he goes not to court her, but rather to take her as his own wife. This forceful language, I think, is mirroring the language used in the Eden narrative when Eve took the forbidden fruit. Additionally, at the end of the story, Samson ends up eating actual forbidden fruit. Not fruit, but food. That food he eats is honey from a beehive that has taken residence in the carcass of this lion that he killed. And then he takes some and gives to his parents, but he doesn't tell them that it came from the carcass of an animal, which would make this a richly unclean food to eat. So Samson right here pretty carelessly breaks one of the stipulations of the Nazirite vow. He eats something that is unclean, but notice that his powers are not taken away. So he broke the Nazirite vow, but his powers aren't taken away. Also, notice how this looks and feels really similar to the Eden narrative when Eve eats something forbidden and then gives that forbidden thing to Adam, bringing him in on the sin too. Here, Samson knowingly eats something unclean and then gives some of that to his parents and makes them unclean in the process. This is really fitting, and it lines up really nicely with Samson's taking of this Philistine woman because she is right in his eyes. So it's like there's a parallel between Samson eating this unclean food in a vineyard, of all places, where they make wine and grapes, and him taking this Philistine woman that he probably should not be courting as a wife. Additionally, it's really curious to me that this all happens while Samson is walking through a vineyard, as I mentioned earlier. He doesn't like eat any grapes or drink any wine while he's here, but it does raise some questions as to how strictly he's adhering to this vow that God placed on him. Okay, so those were some of the major references to the Eden narrative in this chapter, but what's the point of these references? What is their meaning, and how do they illuminate this passage? Well, first, Samson seeing this woman and calling her good in his own eyes is a fall moment for him, but somehow it is also divinely orchestrated by God. Let's remember that in verse 4, we are told by the authors that his parents did not know Samson's desire for this Philistine woman was Yahweh's doing. That's like a whole rabbit hole I will avoid going down right now. But the point here is that even the fall narrative of a hero in the Bible can be painted as God's divinely orchestrated plan. My other takeaway from this story is that Samson's actions don't just affect him. They affect his whole family. His decision to become unclean is passed down onto his parents and makes them unclean too. So Samson isn't doing too hot right now with his vows. He's already breaking them. The first story we receive of Samson is of him marrying a woman he should not be marrying and making himself and his parents richly unclean. A little foreboding. Let's keep going in the story. Judges chapter 14, verse 10. Then his father went down to the woman, and Samson made a feast there, for the young men customarily did this. Now it happened when they saw him, they took 30 companions to be with him. Then Samson said to them, "Let me now propound a riddle to you. If you will indeed tell it to me within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes." There's that number 30 again. "But if you are unable to tell me, then you shall give me 30 linen wraps and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Propound your riddle. Let's hear it." So he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." But they could not tell the riddle in 3 days. Then it happened on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband so that he will tell us the riddle. If you don't do this, we will burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us to impoverish us? Isn't this so?" So Samson's wife wept before him and said, "You only hate me and do not love me. You have propounded a riddle to the sons of my people and have not told it to me." And he said to her, "Behold, I have not told it to my father or mother, so should I tell you?" However, she wept before him 7 days while their feast lasted. And on the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. So that she then told the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day, before the sun went down, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" And he said to them, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Then the Spirit of Yahweh rushed upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 of them, and took their spoil, and gave the changes of clothes to those who told the riddle. His anger burned, and he went up to his father's house. But Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. Okay, notice, first of all, how the numbers 3, 30, and 7 are highlighted here. As we talked about before on this podcast, 3 is a number of testing, and 30 is like an amplified version of 3. It is 3 sets of 10. Here, Samson has 30 groomsmen, a lot of groomsmen, all of whom are Philistine and not Israelite friends or family. And Samson wages 30 sets of clothes with these men on a riddle that he comes up with. Maybe that'd be like 30 suits today, which would be a lot of money if they're good suits. I think the translators really outdid themselves here with the riddle, because they made the riddle, Samson says, rhyme in English. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. I think that's like really, it sounds poetic. The groomsmen cannot figure out this riddle for 3 days. And then after the third day, they go to Samson's wife and threaten to, kill her and her family, like they'll burn down their house if she doesn't help them figure out the riddle. So why such a harsh response over a bet? And what does the number 3 have to do with this? Well, 3 is a number of testing and salvation, as I've mentioned many times before. Here, it is very fitting that Samson makes a bet with 30 of his groomsmen that they cannot pass, and he makes a bet with these 30 groomsmen, and they cannot pass this little test in the form of a riddle. It's also worth noting that there are 3 poetic riddles in this story. First is the riddle by Samson. The second riddle is the answer to the riddle, right? That's also spoken in poetic fashion. The third poetic riddle-like response is given by Samson, which essentially tells these men he knows how they cheated him, and it was through his wife. Samson is testing these men with a riddle, and even though they pass the test of the riddle, they fail the true test as, Samson's groomsmen. They've passed the verbal test, but fail the moral test by cheating and ruthlessly threatening to burn Samson's wife and her father alive. We should remember here that back in verse 4, the authors told us that Samson courting and now marrying this woman was God's doing. That probably includes the wedding and the conflict that has now arisen between Samson and his own groomsmen. So back to our number 3. 3 denotes testing and salvation. Now the Philistines are said to rule over the Israelites at this time, so it seems like they need salvation from these rulers. And what does this test that Samson invokes, this riddle, what does it cause him to do? What causes him to go on a rampage and kill 30 Philistine men in order to give his groomsmen 30 changes of clothes? Now that was a test in the number 3. This wedding takes place very fittingly over 7 days. I don't think I've mentioned this before, but the number 7 in Hebrew is Shavah, and the word Shavah in Hebrew is spelled with the exact same letters as the word for a covenant or oath, which is also Shavah. They're basically the same word in Hebrew. So 7 can oftentimes have a double meaning. It can both denote the symbolism of the number 7 and also the word Shavah, which means a covenant or an oath. That's a little confusing. The easiest way for me to remember this is a story about a famous well in the Bible, Be'er Sheva or Beersheba. Beersheba is a well of 7 and also a well of covenants. If you go back and read how Beersheba got its name, it got its name by a guy named Abraham. And Abraham was having a dispute over a well with a guy named Avimelech. Different Avimelech than Gideon's son from a few episodes ago. In order to resolve this dispute, Abraham gives Avimelech 7 lambs for the well. And they call the well Be'er Sheva, which means well of Sheva. So this could be kind of a pun. It means both well of Sheva, 7, and also well of Sheva, covenant. And it symbolized both the 7 lambs that Abraham paid for the covenant and also the covenant that Abraham made with Avimelech. So hopefully that helps you remember. I was kind of long-winded, but hopefully it helps you remember that 7 in the Bible can denote Sabbath rest, because God rested on the 7th day and everything that comes with the number 7, but also covenants, because the word Shavah in Hebrew literally means covenants. Okay, so let's bring this back to our story. I say that it's fitting that this wedding takes place over 7 days and that on the 7th day, Samson's groomsmen figured out the riddle, because it is like Samson is ratifying this oath of marriage between him and his Philistine wife with betrayal and broken trust. It is on this 7th day that Samson realizes that his wife has been conspiring with his own groomsmen. It is also on this 7th day that Samson will be given the impetus to do what God has been wanting him to do from the outset, to fight back against his rulers and oppressors, to begin to bring about rest for Israel from their oppressors. So instead of resting with his wife on the 7th day, Samson goes on a rampage, kills 30 Philistines, and uses their clothes to pay off the bet he lost. Then he simply gives his wife Then he simply leaves his wife to get some space from their wedding and their marriage, which has gotten off to a really rocky start. While Samson is away, though, his wife is given to his best man. Oof, that's low. I should note here that there are a couple of translations which say Samson's friend here, but then have a little note that says this phrase can also be translated best man. So a lot of Bibles will have like little footnotes, right, that of alternate translations that can be used. And here, a lot of translations will say friend, but the footnote will say best man. The Hebrew word in question that's being translated here is ra'ah. This is the Hebrew word that means to shepherd or to pasture. So literally, Samson's wife is given over to his overseer or his shepherd. You can see why a few translations say friend here, but why a couple also have the alternate translation of best man, because I guess the logic would go that the best man was overseeing the wedding for Samson must have been the equivalent, like the guy who was overseeing or shepherding the wedding for Samson must have been the equivalent of a best man today. So before we move on here, I'd like to pause and try to place ourselves in the sandals of Samson's wife, because I think it could be really easy to see this story as like just a really hot mess. Samson's just straight up killing guys out of revenge. His best man ends up marrying his wife, and his groomsmen threaten to burn down his wife and her father's house. It seems to me that Samson's wife is a bit of a pawn in this whole game. First, her own countrymen, those 30 groomsmen, seem to act like mobsters. They get into this big bet with Samson, and then when it looks like they're going to lose the bet, they go to the bride of this wedding and threaten to burn down her and her father's house if she doesn't coerce her new husband into telling her the secret, and then betray her own husband on their wedding week, like during their wedding. Essentially, they force her to make her husband lose a very big bet and lose out financially and betray his trust while they're committing the rest of their lives together. It seems to me that this girl is a pawn who is used by her family and passed from man to man out of convenience after this. Samson may have only been the only guy who actually really cared about her in her whole life. I say this because even though Samson is angry with her for betraying him after the wedding, it doesn't seem like he knew that the men threatened to burn down her house. He does eventually go back and try to win her back again. And we'll talk about that soon. I'd also like to point out that the 30 groomsmen are not only part of the people group, the Philistines, who are said to actively rule over the Israelites at this time, but they seem to act like mobsters because they threaten their own countrymen and countrywomen if they cannot get what they want. It's just to win a simple bet, right? Samson, on the other hand, in response to this, knows almost immediately that they used his wife to win this bet. But instead of submitting to them, he sends them a message. He kills 30 of their own people, collects the clothes from the men he kills, and presents them to his 30 groomsmen as a way of saying, I'm not scared of you. I'm not going to put up with your antics. As a side note here, as I was reading this, I wondered, did he wash out the blood from the clothes before giving it back to these men? They obviously knew, well, maybe not obviously, they probably knew that they were clothes from their own people, right? Regardless, it definitely seems like an open act of defiance to me on Samson's part. I think you can see this bloodshed by Samson as maybe either or even both an act of revenge and also an act of rebellion and defiance. Violence in this story is very surprisingly initiated by Yahweh. He's the one that set this whole marriage that was going to end in a terrible, terrible failure up in the begin with, remember? That tension is just getting started, however. So let's keep going on in the story. Judges 15 in verse 1. Now it happened after a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, Samson visited his wife with a young goat and said, I will go to my wife in her room. But her father did not let him enter. And her father said, I really thought that you hated her intensely, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please, let her be yours instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches and turned the foxes tail to tail and put one torch in between the middle of the two tails. Then he set fire to the torches and sent the foxes into the standing grain of the Philistines. So he caused both the shocks and the standing grain, along with the vineyards and groves, to burn. Then the Philistines said, "Who did this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he took his wife and gave her to his companion," or best man. So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Then Samson said to them, "If you act like this, then I will surely take revenge on you. But after that, I will cease." And he struck them leg on thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and lived in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Okay, so after a while, we're not told how long, Samson finally wants to come back and make some sort of amends with his wife, by whom he probably feels very betrayed, but also seems to want to work things out. I should also note here the language Samson uses. We are told what is going on through his mind. He said, "I will go into my wife in a room." This probably implies something sexual. The idiom "to go into" is oftentimes a reference to sex in the Bible. But when Samson tries to do this, his father-in-law stops him, and when Samson is understandably angry, his wife's father, or his father-in-law, remarried her off to his best man. His father-in-law has the audacity to suggest that Samson marry his wife's younger sister. He even says, "Is not her younger sister better than her?" This is a terrible father. You can see here why I said earlier that Samson might have been the only man in his wife's life that genuinely loved her and didn't want to manipulate her. Okay, so in response to this, we are given Samson's inner dialogue. And Samson says something really interesting to himself. He says, "This time I will be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm." Innocence and doing harm don't really usually go together in the same sentence. So what's going on here? Well, the word that is translated as innocent here is the Hebrew word nakah. So nakah means to be empty, clear, pure, or free. I like the definitions clear and free the best because when I was researching this word, I found that it is most often used in terms of oaths and obligations, as well as situations where someone is determined to be free of guilt or innocent when looking into a crime. So a great example of nakah, this word, is the first time that it's used in the Bible, actually. In Genesis 24, Abraham makes a covenant, makes his servant take an oath that he will find his son Isaac a wife amongst his own family. When that servant goes on a journey to find Isaac a wife, he meets a potential candidate and a relative named Rebekah. And in recounting Abraham's instructions, Abraham's servant uses the word nakah. This is what he says. Genesis 24, verse 39 through 40. "Then I said to my master, 'Suppose the woman does not follow me.' And he said to me, 'Yahweh, before whom I walked, will send his angel with you to make your journey successful, and you will take a wife for my son, from my relatives, and from my father's house, and then you will be free,' or nakah, 'from my oath when you come to my relatives, and if they do not give her to you, you will be free,' or nakah, 'from my oath.'" This is a bit of a tangent. It's kind of a long tangent. Let's bring it back to the story of Samson. It seems like Samson is saying that once he takes revenge on the Philistines for tricking him and taking his wife away, then he will be free of his obligation to take revenge. It is almost like Samson feels as though he has a duty or an obligation to take vengeance and get even with his enemies. However, I think this word has a very, very interesting double meaning, because let's remember that Samson is a Nazirite, or a dedicated one who is set apart with a vow before Yahweh. His purpose in life is to begin to save Israel from their oppressors. So it's almost like Yahweh is using Samson's desire for revenge to get Samson to fulfill his obligation to become Israel's savior and to free Israel from their oppressors. So the double meaning here would be something like Samson feels an obligation to be nakah, or free of this murderous desire for revenge, and the only outlet for him to do that is in killing his oppressors. But God is also using this spiteful and vengeful spirit in order to use Samson to fulfill or to be free of, or to nakah his obligation as a Nazirite to save his people from their oppressors. I hope that made sense. So Samson does take revenge on the Philistines, and he does it in a really weird way. He takes 300 foxes, ties them together in pairs of two by their tails, and then puts a torch between their tails and lets them loose in the Philistines' grain fields with the torches on fire. Notice here that the number 3, symbolic of testing, and here probably symbolic of salvation, is highlighted again. Samson takes 300 foxes, which almost seems cartoonish in number. And like, this whole thing seems really over the top. Tying them tail to tail, putting a torch between their tails. How would they all go in the right direction towards the grain fields, right? We were told that 3 things burned up in the grain fields, right? The Philistines standing grain, their vineyards, and their groves. Okay, so Samson seems to be beginning to bring about salvation for Israel through the 300 foxes that burned down 3 kinds of the Philistines' resources. Okay, that seems fine and all, but instead of Samson being free from this cycle of revenge, nakah, right? He said he would be free of this. He is further enslaved into this cycle of revenge. The Philistines respond to the burning of their resources by burning Samson's wife and his father-in-law alive. That escalated quickly. And you know what? Even though Samson was probably angry with his wife and his father-in-law, I think this hurts him. I say that this probably hurts him because he responds with even more revenge. And again, we're given some speech from Samson. It's like the internal dialogue that gives us like some insight into his heart. He says to his enemies, "If you act like this, then I will surely take revenge on you, but after that I will cease." Okay, that's really interesting. Notice how Samson does not feel an obligation to take vengeance. Now he doesn't feel an obligation to take vengeance. It's like this, like in this weird, like he has like a moral duty to do so. Instead, Samson seems to think that by him getting even, this revenge will somehow stop. He seems to believe that he can get even one more time, but then after that, he's going to stop for sure. This time, Samson just goes on a killing spree, and we are told that he just struck them leg on thigh. That's also a pretty cartoonish, crazy image, right? I think we're supposed to imagine Samson pretzeling his enemies and crushing them like an accordion. Again, even though this whole scene is really brutal, it is also a bit cartoonish in its imagination, in my opinion. After all of this, Samson retreats to simply be by himself. He goes to, of all places, a place called a cleft in the rock of Etam. So Etam in Hebrew means something like a bird's nest or a wild animal's lair. I think now is a good time to place ourselves in Samson's sandals again. Why would he go alone by himself to this beastly bird's nest or animal's lair and sit in a cleft in a rock? Something that Moses did, right? If you remember, Moses in his story, whenever he meets with God, is like put in a cleft in the rock and to like shield him from God's glory, and God passes by him. Here, Samson's kind of doing the opposite. I think Samson's probably pretty sad. Perhaps he is still mourning for his dead wife. After all, the Philistines probably didn't take away the hurt. Killing Philistines didn't probably take away the hurt and the loss that he's experienced. Additionally, Samson did say that he would cease after this act of vengeance. So maybe he's trying to get away from all this cycle and trying to run away from the Philistines so they can't try to take their revenge, right? As we will see next time, that will not work. Okay, that was a lot today. I would like to end our time today with Samson sitting in this isolated bird's nest, this cleft in the rock of Etam. I know it's kind of sad, but I also think it's a very real reality of Samson's story. When it is all said and done, Samson is, like all the other judges in the Bible, a mixed bag. He has moments of great valor and bravery in the face of national oppressors, but just as much, he has moments of moral compromise and failure that leaves him wounded and alone. And amidst all of this, somehow God is actively using these cycles of revenge to start liberating his people from their oppression. God is like diving into the mud. He's working like through the sins of his messy characters. He's not afraid to jump into the mud and to pull out a few weeds. I think Samson's story carries with it a lot of wisdom about our devotion to the Lord. I think that Samson shows us that we don't have to be perfect to do pala or extraordinary things for God. That God will still work through us even amidst a really, really messy life. Samson also shows us the danger of our imperfections if they are left unchecked. They can leave us in this anti-cleft in the rock, so to speak. This place where you should be alone, meeting with God on the mountain like Moses, but instead you are isolated by yourself, meeting your inner demons. This is the first part of Samson's story, the story of the consecrated crowns, of this example of what a Nazirite should look like, this commentary on the Nazirite vow. So that's all I got for y'all today. I will continue this discussion next time. Thanks for listening, guys.